his 4-year-old son seriously injured in a motorway crash, his life was changed forever. Of course, he was devastated. But interestingly, he's now written a book in which he says he's grateful the tragedy happened and that he's a much better person as a result. Martin's wife Sacha and son Leo were in a car parked on the edge of a motorway when it was hit by a lorry driven by a Belgian man who'd been on the road for 16 hours. He was later sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. When Martin came to the Outlook studio, he told me about his memories of the day the crash happened.
Sacha and I and Leo had just come back from a glorious summer holiday in Italy and in France. She drives me to the train station in the south of England, in the town that we live in. And as I get out of the car, I tell Leo goodbye and I tell him that I love him, as I had done dozens and dozens of times before. And this was just going to be a separation of a couple of days, and something made me get back in the car. Something made me turn around after I had said goodbye to him once. So I put my hand on his cheek and I said, Leo, remember, I'll always be with you. And even as I tell it to you now, it feels over the top.
So did you have a sense of foreboding?
I did. I had butterflies in my stomach. I knew something was up. And this feeling was made worse when I went around the other side of the car to hug Sacha and to kiss her goodbye. And I remember the strange sensation of her body just feeling cold, colder than it should have done, given the warm late summer morning that we had. She got back in the car. She drove off with Leo in the back seat. And I remember thinking, almost uncontrollably, that I've got to do something to make them stop. I've got to do something to make them turn around. And it's a very, very hard thing for an academic like me to say, because it sounds completely non-rational. I remember trying to push those feelings out, and which I did successfully, and I thought, go in the station, get your ticket, and be on your way, which is what I did.
So how did you find out that they'd been involved in an accident?
I was about to give the keynote address at a big international conference. 2 police tracked me down, and I knew something was up instantly, because they couldn't look me in the eye. They said, there's been a motorway crash, your wife has been killed, and your son is very near death in a hospital.
It must be the most appalling thing to hear. How did it affect you when you heard those words?
It was like being bludgeoned. I was struggling with what they said and trying to think, is this true? Maybe it's not my Sacha, maybe it's not my Leo. More police ferried me to the hospital in London where Leo was in intensive care. And I found my only son clinging to life by the thinnest of threads, surrounded by a halo of computer screens under an air blanket regulating his body temperature, because the part of his brain that regulated his body temperature had been damaged.
So you're receiving this shocking sight, and you're also trying to process the fact that your wife has died. How did you react?
Well, it was almost as if it was a good thing that Leo was in such a desperate situation, because it meant that I couldn't really deal with the profound sense of grief over the loss of my wife. She'd always been there to help me get through the difficult moments, to hold my hand and to tell me everything was going to work out all right. But having the need to focus so completely on Leo's recovery created a space that I could be in and process the loss of Sacha in a more gentle and slower way.
I understand what you're saying. Did the doctors give you any idea of what sort of prognosis there was for Leo?
The doctor said, Martin, you have to prepare yourself for the fact that it's likely that he'll die. And I pulled myself together, I composed myself, and I said, well, okay, imagine if everything goes right. What's the best case? And she said, maybe one day attending a school for the severely mentally handicapped. And this, to me, an academic, someone who had lived by his brain and whose wife had lived by her brain, was, my whole world was erased in that instant. And in the morning, Leo was still with me. He had beaten that first prediction, and I latched onto that, and I said, okay, anything else is possible. I don't know where this positivity came from, but it worked. And 10 days after the crash, 10 days after doctors were telling me he would likely die, he was out of a coma.
You must have been absolutely exhausted, weren't you? I mean, to sit going through all this day after day after day in the kind of emotional state that you were in must have really drained you.
It did, but I had this kind of lightness about me. I knew for the first time in my life, absolutely and clearly, what it was I was meant to be doing. I was meant to be the best dad possible to my 4-year-old son. I didn't have any of that worry about mundane stuff like bills and mortgage payments, and not having that just gave me this energy that I sometimes now, today, look back on with some fondness.
It presumably has reset your priorities for life.
Absolutely. When I found out about the crash, I had everything anyone could imagine, yet there was this discontentment a lot of the time, because there was always another line to add to my CV. There was always another project to say yes to. And today, when Leo comes home from school with a sticker from his teacher for doing great work in maths, or when I see him kick a football, I just am so overjoyed, and I am just so grateful.
You presumably had to tell Leo at some point about his mother's death. Was that a very difficult conversation to have?
That was unbelievably hard. I had been telling Leo as he was gradually regaining consciousness that his mother was in another hospital. She wasn't doing as well as he was. She couldn't see anybody. He couldn't go and see her. And all of the nurses and the doctors and the therapists were very, very good about sticking to that story. But as Leo was getting more conscious, he was asking almost every hour that he was awake where his mother was, and it was getting harder for people to keep their story straight. So I finally sat him down on my lap, and I said, Leo, I've got some very sad news to tell you about Mama. She died in the crash. He didn't process it. It was as if I'd said nothing. And I thought, well, do I just reverse tracks? Do we just put it off more? And I thought, no, we're here. We've got to finish it. So I told him that she wouldn't be with us in the flesh anymore, but she would always be with us in our hearts. And finally, after repeated attempts, when he did understand it, when he did get it, he just opened his mouth and he just started crying and crying and crying. I don't know how long it was in reality. It felt like it was 20 minutes. And when he composed himself, he said, I wish that you and Mama could change places. I wish she was alive and I wish you were dead.
How did it feel to hear that?
I told him instantly, and I honestly felt this, that I had wished that same thing, because Sacha was such an unbelievable mother, and I worried about my own ability to pull Leo back from where he was.
He's obviously made a pretty miraculous recovery, but what is his state of health now, and what lies ahead for him?
His recovery has been astounding. It has stupefied so many of the doctors, particularly the doctors that told me to prepare for him dying. He is still getting speech and language therapy. He's got some cognitive issues. He's got lots of surgery in front of him.
Let's just talk for a second about the man who caused this crash, the lorry driver. In the book, you write a letter to him. Why did you feel that you needed to write to him?
We were approaching the time when I was told he was about to get out of prison. It was about 8 months after the crash, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to try and reach out to him, because I was losing sleep over something. And I had in my mind something that Leo said. He said, Papa, I expect the lorry driver feels a bit sad too. I knew he had 2 kids of his own, and I thought he didn't want to do this. He didn't want to cause the crash.
But he had been driving more hours than he was legally permitted to do, hadn't he?
Yes, yeah. For the 3 days prior to the crash, he had been driving over his legal limit. He hadn't been taking the required breaks.
And don't you feel angry about that?
When the police, our police liaison, told me Leo was still in the hospital at the time. She told me, Martin, the driver isn't cooperating. And I had every right to say, damn it, do what you can to get this guy and to send him away for a very long time. But it just wasn't there. It was as if I intuited somehow that getting caught up in blame and desire for punishment was a distraction from the work I was doing with Leo. And when the police was telling me this, he was expecting me to be angry. And I said, tell him I forgive him. So I wrote this letter, and I called the police liaison, and they say, well, we're sorry, but the driver's been released, repatriated back to Belgium, and there's no way we can find him. We don't have an address for him. We're sorry. At that moment, I felt even more desperate.
But there was nothing you could do about it, presumably. So is publishing it in the book a way of putting it to rest for you?
It is, but it's not the obsession that it was.
So how do you see your life going forward? People talk about achieving closure after some of these things. I have no idea what that really means in practice, but do you think that in a way you can never close off an episode like this, that it will always be with you? Or is there going to be a time when you put it to one side and you go back to being a driven academic with a career and so on?
This is not something that ever leaves you, nor would I ever want it to leave me. I will remember Sacha every day. I will remember our lives together every day. And I will miss her every day until the end of my days. But that hasn't stopped me from growing as a person.
Martin Spinelli. His book is called After the Crash. But that's all from today's programme. I'm Matthew Bannister. Join me again for